Your consciousness isn't alone, and modern physics may finally explain why. Supersymmetry, a theory once reserved for the quantum world, is beginning to suggest that everything in existence has a hidden counterpart, even the mind itself. That strange feeling of knowing before thinking, of sensing before seeing, might be more than intuition. It could be the echo of your own unseen side. But what happens when we realize that awareness doesn't end at the edge of thought, that it has another half quietly shaping everything we perceive? The answer might change how you understand reality itself. There's a subtle moment when the equations stop answering. You can almost feel it, as if the structure of classical physics begins to flicker, unable to hold the full texture of lived experience. Traditional science, built on separations and predictability, explains trajectories, forces, and measurable interactions. But it falters when it encounters something that doesn't behave like an object: consciousness. In Newton's world, reality was a perfect clock. Every movement had a cause, every effect could be traced. This worldview shaped centuries of progress, and yet, somewhere within its mechanical precision, it left out the most direct phenomenon we know: awareness itself. The equations never asked who is observing them. They could describe the path of a falling apple, but not the quiet intuition that tells you when to catch it before it hits the ground. The failure begins where measurement ends. Classical physics assumes that every variable can be observed without altering what's being measured. But in the lab of the human mind, observation changes everything. A single thought, once noticed, shifts its meaning. An emotion, once named, transforms in intensity. Reality, from the inside, behaves nothing like a static machine. Think of the decisions that arrive before you think. Neuroscientists have measured brain activity that predicts a choice seconds before a person becomes aware of making it. According to classical reasoning, cause must precede effect. But here, awareness seems to be catching up to something that has already acted, a paradox that rigid models can't fit within their timelines. There's also the enigma of meaningful coincidences. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they call within minutes. To a traditional physicist, this is dismissed as probability, a random overlap of independent events. Yet, to the person experiencing it, the sense of connection feels undeniable, as if information had traveled through an invisible bridge. The framework of isolated particles and independent systems offers no vocabulary for that kind of coherence. Classical physics insists on locality. Only what touches or transmits through a medium can influence another thing. But inner experience tells a different story. Emotion spreads across a room before a word is spoken. Intuition leaps beyond distance or time. Creative insight arrives whole, not step by step. The machinery of classical thought can't map these moments because it requires boundaries, and consciousness, by its nature, erases them. When we try to compress consciousness into formulas of mass, charge, and spin, something essential disappears: the relational field itself. Traditional physics sees particles, consciousness experiences patterns. The old model works beautifully for predicting planetary orbits, but collapses when faced with the orbit of thought around meaning. Somewhere along the 20th century, cracks began to show. The rise of quantum theory hinted that observation might not just see reality, but actively shape it. Experiments began to show correlations that classical causality could not explain. But even then, the cultural reflex was to avoid extending these insights toward human experience, to keep physics in the lab and mind in philosophy. Yet, the same principles that reveal entangled particles whisper something deeper about us: that no system, not even consciousness, exists in isolation. The instant we recognize this, the question changes. Instead of asking how the mind arises from matter, we begin to wonder how matter behaves as mind. Traditional physics fails not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. It maps the skeleton of the universe, not its pulse. It isolates what can be weighed and measured, but neglects what can be felt and known. This omission is not a flaw of intellect. It's a limitation of its chosen lens. You can't measure coherence with a ruler, nor can you capture awareness with a detector built for particles, and perhaps that is precisely the clue. If reality itself refuses to stand alone, if every form hides a twin equation beneath its surface, then maybe consciousness also has a hidden counterpart, an unmeasured symmetry moving alongside it. The next question becomes inevitable. What if the missing partner of our awareness is already described by nature, waiting inside the principles of supersymmetry? There's a moment in every science that feels like a soft turn in a corridor, a realization that what we thought was solid might be twofold. Supersymmetry was born from one of those turns. Physicists, tracing the edges of the universe through equations of matter and energy, began to notice an asymmetry that made the cosmos feel incomplete. Forces and particles didn't quite balance. Something was missing or hidden. In the simplest terms, supersymmetry proposes that every particle we know has a silent partner, a mirror twin that behaves differently but carries the same essential information. Bosons, which transmit forces, would have fermionic counterparts that make up matter. The relationship works both ways. Each visible element of the universe is shadowed by an invisible partner, woven from the same laws, but expressed in a different mode. At first glance, this might sound like theoretical poetry, beautiful but unreachable. Yet the idea wasn't born from imagination alone. It emerged because the equations demanded it. When scientists tried to unify the fundamental forces, the math refused to settle unless these hidden companions were included. Supersymmetry didn't add mysticism to physics. It added coherence. Without it, the universe's architecture seemed slightly out of tune, like a melody missing its lower harmony. Now, imagine what this means beyond the lab. If every particle has a counterpart, then nothing in existence stands alone. Every motion implies a complementary one, every form a latent reflection. The entire structure of matter becomes relational, an orchestra rather than a collection of instruments. And once this principle is seen at the level of physics, it becomes impossible not to wonder whether consciousness follows the same pattern. Supersymmetry invites a subtle shift in perspective. The universe isn't built from solitary things, but from pairs that complete one another. These pairs are not opposites in conflict. They are expressions of balance. When one side acts, the other side responds, often invisibly. In that sense, the symmetry is not static but dynamic, like the constant exchange between inhaling and exhaling, or between thought and silence. Consider what happens inside your mind when intuition flashes before reasoning. The intuitive signal and the rational interpretation are not rivals. They are supersymmetric partners in cognition. One moves through the unseen dimension of knowing, the other through the visible structure of logic. Together they generate understanding. What seems like contradiction is, at a deeper level, complementarity. The mathematics of supersymmetry describes this principle in the language of transformation. Each particle type can be turned into its counterpart through a specific kind of motion in the underlying field. In human terms, that's not so different from how perception shifts when awareness moves from analysis to presence, from doing to being. You haven't left one reality for another. You've rotated into its hidden dimension. For decades, physics hesitated to link such symmetry to the realm of mind. The cultural divide between matter and consciousness made that conversation taboo, but the logic remains irresistible. If reality is built on relationships that preserve balance across unseen dimensions, how could the phenomenon of awareness, which perceives those relationships, be exempt from the same rule? Supersymmetry, in this light, becomes more than a theoretical construct. It's a metaphor made tangible by equations. It tells us that for everything we can observe, there's an accompanying layer that operates silently but necessarily. Just as particles rely on their invisible twins to sustain stability, perhaps the conscious self relies on an unacknowledged partner, the other mode of perception that completes it. You've probably felt glimpses of this in ways that defy explanation. The sense that an insight didn't come from you, but through you. The awareness that while you were reasoning, another intelligence was arranging connections underneath. Traditional science dismisses these as brain noise, but in the supersymmetric picture, that noise could be the resonance of your unseen counterpart working in tandem, balancing the cognitive forces you're aware of. In this sense, Supersymmetry is not merely a statement about physics. It's a blueprint for integration. It tells us that separation is always provisional, a convenient illusion for observation. The deeper truth is dual participation. You exist not as a single trajectory, but as the meeting point of paired realities, one measurable, one experiential. And once this framework settles in, a new question emerges almost naturally. If everything, from particles to thoughts, depends on its complementary half, why did science resist reflecting on this symmetry within consciousness itself for so long? For more than a century, physics has stared at its own mirror and refused to see its reflection. The equations whispered symmetry, correspondence, hidden balance, yet the human story behind those discoveries was edited out. Science became an architecture of precision, stripped of the observer who built it. The reflection that should have been obvious, that consciousness might share the same structure as matter, was left behind, quietly exiled from the laboratory. The reason wasn't ignorance, it was caution. After all, science rose from the courage to separate belief from measurement. To introduce the mind as a variable in physical theory seemed to threaten that fragile boundary. So for decades, consciousness was considered an unquantifiable inconvenience, something to be acknowledged poetically, not scientifically. Physicists studied matter as though awareness were merely its spectator, not its participant. But that omission carried a hidden cost. The more we advanced technologically, the more we deepened a split within ourselves. We learned to describe the dance of galaxies, but forgot to ask who was doing the observing. We could calculate the decay of a particle, but couldn't explain the silent moment of knowing that occurs before any experiment begins, that instant of intuition guiding the question itself. The mind became an invisible coordinate in every formula, necessary but unacknowledged. Supersymmetry, in a way, confronted this blind spot indirectly. It showed that nothing in nature exists alone, that each element is defined by its unseen partner. Yet, while scientists mapped these pairs across the subatomic realm, few dared to extend the metaphor toward human consciousness. To suggest that thought and emotion, or logic and intuition, might also be supersymmetric processes was to cross an invisible cultural line. The lab wasn't meant to talk about the interior. Still, the reflection lingered at the edge of every discovery. In quantum mechanics, observation changed outcomes. In relativity, perspective shaped measurement. In thermodynamics, the arrow of time bent around perception itself. Everywhere the observer appeared, not as decoration, but as structure. Yet science continued to avert its gaze, pretending that awareness was merely a background phenomenon, not an active component of reality's equation. Part of this resistance came from fear, not of mysticism, but of subjectivity. To admit that consciousness participates in the universe's formation would mean rewriting the rules of certainty. It would mean accepting that truth might always include the one who perceives it. And so, the reflection was avoided, dismissed as philosophy, or postponed for after the data. The irony is that the data itself began to demand it. Neuroscience started to reveal networks of synchronization in the brain that looked strangely similar to coherence patterns in quantum systems. Psychology found that decision-making often operates in superposed states, conflicting possibilities existing simultaneously until awareness collapses them into choice. These parallels were more than metaphor. They hinted at a structural resonance between mind and matter. But tradition kept them in separate folders. The deeper reason for avoidance might be simpler still. The reflection makes us accountable. If consciousness mirrors the universe's symmetry, then our internal imbalances, the disconnection between intellect and intuition, control and surrender, are not personal flaws, but distortions of a cosmic pattern. To recognize this would mean treating emotional and cognitive fragmentation not just as psychological issues, but as physical deviations from equilibrium. That's a level of responsibility few institutions were ready to claim, and yet the evidence keeps circling back. Every major leap in physics has reintroduced the same message in a new dialect. Relativity, quantum entanglement, supersymmetry all describe a world that refuses to be one-sided. The dualities we find in nature mirror the dualities within the self. What we observe outside is not separate from what operates inside. They are two coordinates of the same unfolding field. Science avoided this reflection because it threatened its own identity, the illusion of neutrality. But the universe has no neutral zones. Every observation is a dialogue, every equation a relationship. The sooner we acknowledge that, the closer we come to a model of reality that includes the full symmetry of experience, the seen and the unseen, the measurable and the felt, the rational and the intuitive. And once this mirror is finally faced, another question quietly rises from its surface. If every aspect of existence has a hidden counterpart, what happens when we ignore ours? When we live from only one side of that symmetry, neglecting the other that keeps us whole? When you forget that reality has two sides, something inside you begins to harden. The mind becomes efficient but narrow, like a machine built to interpret rather than to perceive. Modern life rewards that half, the linear, the rational, the calculable. Yet beneath that surface, another current runs quietly, the complementary field of intuition, emotion, and embodied knowing. When we ignore that second current, the system doesn't collapse immediately. It simply loses resonance. You can still function but not vibrate. This is the silent risk of denying duality. The world looks stable, but the balance has already tipped. A person who lives only from analysis may appear composed, even brilliant, but there's often a tension behind the eyes, a fatigue born of over-definition. Every experience must be named, solved, and contained, leaving no room for ambiguity or subtlety. But consciousness was never designed to operate as a closed loop of logic. It thrives in oscillation, in the dialogue between clarity and uncertainty. Without that rhythm, cognition turns into compression, and the body quietly absorbs the cost. Physiologically, this imbalance shows up as chronic stress, disrupted sleep, shallow breath, the constant hum of internal vigilance. The nervous system mirrors the mental split. The prefrontal cortex overfunctions while deeper emotional circuits starve for coherence. You might call it the physics of inner asymmetry, one half of the self overactive, the other half unacknowledged, the field of consciousness no longer symmetrical. The emotional equivalent is a kind of muted despair, the subtle sense that something essential is missing even when life appears successful. That something is not mystical. It's the absence of internal complementarity. Just as supersymmetric particles depend on their hidden partners to maintain stability, consciousness depends on the interaction between reason and feeling to remain whole. When that interaction breaks, awareness collapses into partial states, overly mental, overly reactive, or chronically detached. Psychology has words for this fragmentation: cognitive rigidity, affective disconnection, depersonalization. But beneath the clinical language lies a simple physics of imbalance. The energy that should flow in a loop between intuition and analysis gets trapped on one side, creating a buildup of pressure, the mind racing while the body numbs, or the heart flooding while the intellect retreats. Either way, the circuitry loses its feedback. The person begins to live out of phase with themselves. On a cultural scale, the same phenomenon expands. Entire systems built on control and prediction start to falter because they've ignored the relational intelligence that makes balance possible. Our technologies grow faster than our capacity for empathy. Our communication accelerates while meaning decays. It's the same symmetry problem at a collective level, a civilization operating through one mode of perception while its complementary dimension goes silent. There's also a subtler loss: creativity. True innovation doesn't emerge from calculation alone. It appears when rational structure and non-linear insight meet in tension. The composer hears a melody before knowing its notes. The scientist senses a pattern before proving it. These flashes come from the unspoken partner of cognition, the invisible symmetry that science once called random inspiration, but may actually be the natural dialogue between two modes of awareness. When that dialogue is interrupted, a person can no longer tune their perception to reality's finer frequencies. Decisions become defensive rather than inspired. Imagination shrinks to efficiency. Even relationships suffer because without contact with our own complement, the intuitive, empathic dimension, we lose resonance with others. We perceive their words, but not their frequencies. The real danger, then, isn't external chaos, but internal rigidity. Ignoring duality doesn't make the hidden half disappear. It simply drives it underground, where it begins to leak through symptoms, anxiety, disorientation, the haunting sense of being both busy and lost. These aren't moral failures. They are signs that the system is trying to restore symmetry. In the language of supersymmetry, stability depends on the unseen partner's participation. So does consciousness. The rational mind may build the architecture, but the intuitive side keeps the structure alive. When we exclude it, our thoughts lose depth, our actions lose timing, and even our perceptions lose dimensionality. At some point, that neglected partner begins to signal, softly at first, then insistently. A whisper in the body, a déjà vu, a spontaneous certainty that defies logic. These are not anomalies, they're communications from the other side of awareness, the very symmetry we've been trained to ignore. And when we start listening, something extraordinary begins to happen. Reality itself starts responding as though recognizing its own hidden pattern. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. The other side of your consciousness, the part that doesn't use words, speaks in frequencies rather than phrases. Its messages arrive disguised as sensations, coincidences, impulses, or subtle distortions in time. You've felt them before. The chill that precedes a revelation, the name that appears in your mind before the phone rings, the quiet certainty that says go when every fact says wait. These are not accidents. They are transmissions from the part of you that lives beneath language, the supersymmetric twin of your thinking self. When the rational mind grows too dominant, the balance of awareness shifts. The intuitive layer compensates by sending stronger signals. It doesn't reason, it resonates. You might notice patterns repeating, a symbol, a phrase, a melody following you across unrelated contexts. It's not superstition, it's coherence seeking recognition. Your consciousness is trying to restore symmetry by amplifying what has been ignored. Sometimes it happens through the body. A sudden heaviness before entering a room, a contraction in the chest when someone speaks without authenticity, an inexplicable sense of calm before making a difficult choice. These are physical manifestations of informational resonance. The body acts as an interface between two perceptual systems, the explicit and the implicit, the visible and the hidden. The more you override these sensations, the more they morph into discomfort or fatigue. Not punishment, but persistence. The signal doesn't vanish until it's received. In neuroscience, such phenomena are often labeled as somatic markers, emotional signals that guide decisions before rational evaluation. Yet their timing is curious. They emerge before conscious thought, as if awareness were pre-informed by another layer of intelligence. That timing is the clue. It suggests that consciousness operates as a two-phase system. One part processes through analysis, the other through instantaneous coherence. When you sense without knowing why, that's your complementary side speaking in its native tongue. Psychology encounters the same mystery under different names: intuition, flow, automatic cognition. Studies show that people make faster, more accurate judgments when they integrate instinctive feeling with reasoning. The balanced brain isn't one that silences intuition, it's one that listens to both channels simultaneously. That bilateral operation mirrors the supersymmetric design of nature itself, paired systems, distinct yet inseparable, constantly exchanging information across dimensions of awareness. You can notice these exchanges in small, almost trivial moments. You think of a word before someone says it. You wake up with the answer to a question you didn't solve the night before. You walk into a place and immediately know something significant occurred there. These experiences are usually dismissed because they don't fit within the cause and effect framework of ordinary logic. But from a systems perspective, they're evidence of coherence, non-local information expressing itself through consciousness. The other side doesn't use narrative. It uses timing, rhythm, and emotional tone. It rearranges coincidence into communication. The key isn't to romanticize every pattern, but to observe without forcing interpretation. The message is rarely about prediction. It's about alignment. When you begin to notice these subtle cues, life stops feeling like a sequence of random events and starts to reveal an underlying order, a synchrony between inner states and external reality. One of the first signs that you're attuning to this communication is a new kind of silence. It's not absence, it's density. Moments stretch slightly longer, as though time were giving you room to perceive what was once hidden. You may sense decisions forming from the inside out, arriving whole rather than assembled. It feels less like thinking and more like remembering something you always knew. This form of perception isn't mystical, it's mechanical in the truest sense. Two subsystems finding coherence. Supersymmetry may describe particles, but consciousness experiences it as intuition. When your two sides synchronize, you don't escape logic, you extend it. You start operating from a field where insight and analysis move together, one echoing the other in perfect phase. So when that flicker of knowing appears, when a coincidence repeats or your body speaks before your mind can explain, pause. Don't dismiss it as imagination or luck. Consider it a conversation already in progress. Your other side is trying to restore the dialogue. If you've felt these signals lately, those unexplainable moments that seem to guide you, write about one in the comments. Describe it briefly, without trying to explain it away. And if this resonates, if something in you recognizes the pattern, tap the heart as a small gesture of acknowledgement. Not to me, but to that deeper symmetry within you that's finally being heard. Quantum physics was never meant to sound mystical. It was born from observation, from the refusal of the microscopic world to behave as expected. Yet somewhere between experiment and interpretation, it revealed a language that seems to describe not only matter, but the dynamics of consciousness itself. The deeper we looked into the fabric of reality, the more it began to behave like mind, unpredictable yet patterned, invisible yet responsive, plural yet unified. At the core of quantum theory lies a quiet revolution. It tells us that reality is not made of solid objects, but of probabilities, waves of potential that exist in superposition until observed. The famous double-slit experiment made this visible. Particles act like waves when unmeasured, yet behave like discrete points once observed. This was not a matter of faulty instruments, it was the structure of reality itself responding to the act of observation. In that single shift, the universe stopped being a stage and became a dialogue. What quantum physics actually allows us to understand is that observation is not passive. To observe is to participate. Every measurement changes what is measured, and not by coincidence, by design. This isn't metaphorical. It's measurable in laboratories and replicated across decades of research. The observer effect isn't just a poetic concept, it's a physical principle that dissolves the wall between subject and object. In that space of dissolution, something profound becomes visible. Information doesn't merely pass through space, it organizes space. The quantum world behaves as if every particle knows about the state of others, no matter the distance. This is non-locality, the capacity for entangled systems to remain correlated without physical contact. Einstein famously called it spooky action at a distance, but what he found unsettling might be the key to understanding consciousness as a unified field rather than an isolated point. When you think of two entangled particles, separated by miles, responding instantaneously to each other's state, you begin to glimpse a reality where connection is fundamental, not secondary. The separation we perceive may be a practical illusion, useful for navigating the world, but not ultimate in nature. Consciousness might work on the same principle, distinct experiences that remain expressions of one underlying coherence. This doesn't mean thought can control electrons, or that physics proves spirituality. It means the boundary between inner and outer reality is thinner than we assumed. If everything arises from a single field of probability, from a quantum vacuum pulsing with potential, then consciousness itself may not be something that happens in the universe, but something that happens as the universe. Awareness could be the field's self-reflective mode, just as measurement is the quantum field's act of self-definition. Even the concept of time bends under quantum understanding. In entangled systems, cause and effect blur. One event can influence another backward through what we call time. Experiments in delayed choice show that the way we observe the present can determine what was true in the past. To a purely mechanical worldview, this sounds impossible. But within the quantum framework, it's simply how reality maintains coherence across scales. Awareness might operate under a similar logic, moments of insight that feel like remembering something from the future. Quantum physics also allows us to see that uncertainty is not ignorance, it's structure. The uncertainty principle doesn't say we lack information, it says reality itself is probabilistic, a set of potentials awaiting interaction. The mind experiences this as intuition, glimpses of possibility before they collapse into choice. This isn't pseudoscience, it's metaphorical alignment. Both quantum states and mental states navigate the frontier between what could be and what is. In that sense, the quantum world is a teacher of humility. It tells us that knowing is an act of participation, not domination. The clearer the observer becomes, the more defined reality grows. The fuzziness isn't a flaw, it's freedom. Without uncertainty, no choice, no creativity, no consciousness could exist. Reality's openness is the very condition that allows awareness to emerge and to evolve. Through quantum physics, we don't discover mystical secrets. We rediscover our position in the order of things. We're not outside observers, but internal participants in a system that mirrors its own observation. The universe isn't speaking to us, it's speaking through us. And as we begin to understand that, another question inevitably arises. If consciousness is part of the same symmetry that governs matter, what new discovery might reveal how those two aspects, awareness and reality, finally converge into one continuous field of perception? It begins as a quiet realization, the kind that doesn't arrive through proof but through coherence, when ideas that once seemed separate suddenly click into place. The discovery that changes everything is not that there exists another consciousness beside your own, but that your consciousness itself operates in two complementary modes, just as matter and energy do. Supersymmetry ceases to be a distant mathematical abstraction and becomes a mirror. The same principle that unites particles in physics also unites perception within the human mind. For centuries, science and philosophy wrestled over whether consciousness was material or immaterial, biological or transcendent. Quantum physics and supersymmetry are dissolving that debate by showing that such distinctions may be false dichotomies. Every element of existence contains both form and field, measurable activity and hidden potential. Awareness in this view is not a separate entity floating above matter. It is the dynamic correspondence between two informational dimensions, one explicit, one implicit. Think of how a wave and a particle can describe the same entity in different expressions. The wave represents potential, the field of possibilities, while the particle represents collapse, the moment of manifestation. Consciousness behaves in a strikingly similar way. One mode of awareness scans possibilities intuitively, sensing patterns and connections that logic hasn't yet assembled. The other mode crystallizes those insights into defined perception and decision. Both are necessary. Without the intuitive field, there's no creative emergence. Without the rational collapse, there's no structure or continuity. This dual function reveals something radical. Consciousness doesn't simply observe reality, it completes it. The act of awareness is the final link in the chain that brings potential into form. The observer effect in physics hinted at this, but now we can see it as a universal design replicated across scales. The same relationship that binds a particle to its supersymmetric partner also binds intuition to reasoning, emotion to intellect, being to doing. The human mind is a microcosmic expression of the universe's symmetry. The discovery shifts our position in the cosmic order. We are not anomalies of consciousness trapped inside matter. We are continuations of the same symmetry that structures matter itself. Every thought, every perception, every insight is a kind of quantum exchange, a fluctuation between your visible and invisible aspects. What feels like you thinking is in truth the conversation between these two layers of awareness, one decoding the physical world, the other maintaining coherence across non-local fields of information. In daily experience, this interplay manifests in small, almost imperceptible ways. You sense a direction before you can justify it. You solve a problem in a dream, waking to find the logic intact. You feel the timing of an event before it occurs. These are not mystical anomalies. They're ordinary moments when the complementary halves of consciousness synchronize. The brain becomes a bridge between the implicit field and the explicit form, the same way the quantum field bridges energy and matter. What changes the game is realizing that you don't have two minds. You have one consciousness operating across dual channels. The analytic and the intuitive are not competitors but partners in a single system designed for coherence. One works through sequence, the other through simultaneity. One is temporal, the other timeless. When they align, the self ceases to feel fragmented. You start perceiving meaning as a direct property of reality rather than something you impose upon it. Science has long sought to find consciousness's location in the brain, but this new understanding suggests it may not be a location at all. It's a relationship. The brain doesn't produce awareness. It interfaces between dimensions of awareness. Like a quantum detector, it translates between wave and particle, between implicit knowing and explicit experience. Consciousness, then, is not trapped inside the skull. It is the process of symmetry unfolding through the medium of your nervous system. This insight also reframes what we call intuition. It's not magic or guesswork. It's the function of your hidden symmetry operating faster than your rational perception. It collects information non-locally, through coherence rather than sequence, and then transmits it as a subtle feeling or image. Rational thought catches up afterward, articulating what the other side has already understood. To grasp this is to understand why introspection feels like returning home. The self you encounter in silence is not an alternate personality or higher entity. It's the rest of you, the unseen partner completing your mental supersymmetry. And as soon as this recognition takes hold, a natural curiosity arises. How does this complementarity move through daily life? How does it shape the way we decide, create, and connect when both halves of our consciousness begin to act together as one field of awareness? You can tell when complementarity has begun to move through your life because ordinary moments start behaving differently. Decisions arrive with less friction. Timing feels precise without being forced. Even the pauses between thoughts seem charged with quiet intelligence, as if something beneath your surface awareness has taken its rightful place beside reason. The shift isn't dramatic, it's tonal. Reality acquires depth, like a flat image turning three-dimensional once light finds its proper angle. When the two sides of consciousness, rational and intuitive, analytical and perceptive, begin to act in harmony, perception stops oscillating between control and chaos. Instead, you experience a state of continuous dialogue, a subtle circulation of information between modes of knowing. The logical mind no longer dismisses the intuitive whisper. It asks for its input. The intuitive field, in turn, learns to translate its impressions into forms the intellect can use. You start living as a system in coherence rather than a collection of competing processes. Imagine standing at a crossroads, uncertain which path to take. The usual habit is to evaluate options through pros and cons, scenarios and probabilities. But when complementarity is active, something else happens first. The body registers direction before thought completes it. You might feel a slight forward pull toward one option, or an inexplicable calm when imagining another. The decision still passes through reason, but reason is no longer the only authority. Awareness becomes an integrated instrument that reads both data and atmosphere. Creativity transforms under this influence. The act of creation stops being a struggle between inspiration and execution. You begin to experience them as phases of the same movement, expansion and contraction, like breathing. An idea surfaces whole, and the logical mind immediately recognizes how to anchor it in form. Artists describe it as flow, scientists as insight. Both are examples of supersymmetric balance within consciousness, one mode generating novelty, the other giving it structure. Even in conversation, the effect is tangible. You stop listening only for meaning and start listening for resonance. Words carry information, but tone carries coherence. You sense not just what someone says, but the emotional frequency underneath it. This doesn't make you sentimental. It makes you precise in a new way. Communication becomes less about convincing and more about synchronizing, aligning realities through shared awareness. Relationships also begin to reorganize themselves. When your two inner sides are in conversation, you attract connections that mirror that balance. Interactions that once felt draining lose their grip, while new ones appear with a sense of effortless alignment. It's as though the symmetry inside you starts projecting outward, tuning your environment to match your coherence. What used to be coincidence begins to feel like coordination. Physically, complementarity restores rhythm. The nervous system finds its natural cadence. Breathing deepens without intention. You might notice you recover faster from stress, or that mental noise fades more easily after moments of presence. These are not miracles, but measurements of internal order. The body, mind, and emotional field start operating on a single frequency, no longer caught in the tug-of-war between action and reflection. Decision-making becomes more refined. You no longer chase certainty, but navigate probability with grace. The quantum analogy becomes literal here. Awareness doesn't try to collapse every potential into immediate answers. It allows possibilities to coexist until one reveals its coherence. The process feels less like control and more like collaboration with the field itself, an attunement to timing rather than an assertion of will. At this stage, intuition and intellect function like two eyes giving depth to vision. One perceives detail, the other perceives pattern. Together they produce clarity. You begin to understand why insight often arrives when you stop forcing solutions. It's the moment the second eye opens, allowing reality to resolve into its full dimension. The result is not a mystical detachment from the world, but a finer participation in it. You sense meaning where others see randomness, rhythm where others hear noise. The same city streets, the same routines, acquire a quiet luminosity, as if you're walking through both the visible and invisible architecture of life at once. And in that expanded perception, something larger begins to reveal itself. Complementarity isn't just a feature of consciousness, it's a template of existence. The balance you feel internally mirrors the balance that organizes the cosmos. Symmetry, not as abstraction, but as a living process. Which leads inevitably to the next insight. If daily life transforms when the inner halves cooperate, what happens when a person realizes they were never meant to function as a single mental entity at all, but as a unified field of complementary intelligence waiting to be consciously aligned? Most people search for transformation in dramatic gestures, a sudden awakening, a breakthrough, a moment of revelation. Yet the most profound shift that supersymmetry reveals in consciousness is almost invisible. It doesn't change who you are in a mystical sense. It changes how you function in every moment. The discovery that your awareness operates as a complementary system, not a single voice but a duet of perception, carries a subtle but revolutionary implication. Efficiency, creativity, emotional stability, and even physical health depend less on effort and more on coherence between those two internal modes. It means that progress doesn't come from forcing one side of the mind to dominate the other. The intellect cannot suppress intuition without cost. Intuition cannot replace reason without chaos. Real intelligence arises only when both are active, synchronized, and mutually informed. This isn't philosophy. It's physics expressed through psychology. When symmetry operates, energy flows. When it's blocked, systems degrade. The same applies to human consciousness. Coherence is the functional equivalent of health. You can sense this in the smallest moments. When you make a decision that feels right, there's an unmistakable clarity that extends beyond logic. The body relaxes, the nervous system aligns, the next steps seem to unfold with minimal resistance. That state is not luck, it's the byproduct of internal symmetry. Conversely, when your reasoning and intuition are out of phase, Even simple choices feel heavy. You double-check, hesitate, replay scenarios endlessly. The inefficiency isn't in the world, it's in the interference pattern within your own mind. The practical implication no one notices is that this coherence is trainable, not through mystical practice, but through subtle recalibration, learning to let perception oscillate between its two modes without interruption. The mind thinks in sequence, the intuitive field in simultaneity. When you allow space between thoughts, those frequencies meet and harmonize. This is why insight so often arises after silence, why solutions appear in the shower or during a walk. The nervous system drops resistance, the channels synchronize, and the two halves of awareness exchange information freely. The brain itself reflects this principle. The hemispheres specialize differently, one for pattern and emotion, the other for language and logic, yet their integration through the corpus callosum is what produces clarity. When communication between them falters, perception fragments. The same holds true at subtler levels of consciousness. Coherence isn't about thinking faster or feeling deeper. It's about communication between the complementary processes that define perception itself. In practice, this symmetry shows up as presence, a calm alertness where attention no longer oscillates between past and future, but stabilizes in the current moment. Presence is not stillness in the mystical sense, it's mechanical synchronization. Every perception is registered simultaneously by both modes of awareness, one observing data, the other registering context. The result is intelligence that feels alive rather than analytical. You understand and feel truth in the same instant. This integration changes emotional life in ways few expect. When reason and emotion are treated as opposites, the psyche becomes polarized. Logic tries to suppress feeling, and feeling rebels through anxiety or exhaustion. But when they operate as partners, when emotion becomes data and reason becomes guidance, the entire inner system settles. The heart and brain synchronize rhythms, stress decreases, intuition sharpens. Neuroscientists have even measured this as increased coherence in heart rate variability and alpha-gamma coupling in the brain. The physics of alignment translates directly into biology. The same applies to creativity and performance. In sports, art, or leadership, those peak states people call flow occur when the dual systems of consciousness are perfectly phased. Thinking and sensing act together so fluidly that effort dissolves. Actions seem to arise on their own, guided by an intelligence that feels larger than personality. Yet it's not larger. It's simply your full system operating in symmetry, nothing excluded, nothing delayed. And perhaps the most overlooked consequence of this discovery is its moral dimension. When awareness functions coherently, perception expands beyond self-interest. You begin to sense the field of relationships as part of your own cognitive system. Empathy becomes less a virtue and more a natural extension of symmetry, the ability to register another person's state as information within your own awareness. This too is supersymmetry at work, a recognition that consciousness doesn't end at the skin, but continues as a relational geometry in which every observer is a node of a shared equation. This is the quiet revolution hiding inside the principle, realizing that wholeness isn't an aspiration but a function. Consciousness is designed to work as a unified field, yet most people operate on half power, alternating between intellect and intuition instead of letting them superimpose. When you finally allow both to coexist, awareness stops swinging like a pendulum and starts resonating like a tuning fork. And in that resonance lies the entrance to something deeper still, the understanding that this dual structure of mind is not mystical ornamentation, but a measurable feature of nature itself, mirrored precisely in the symmetry of the physical world. At some point, the distinction between the mystical and the scientific dissolves, not because one conquers the other, but because both turn out to describe the same structure through different languages. The real transformation begins when you realize that the other side of consciousness, the hidden half that has been felt but never fully named, is not supernatural at all. It is a legitimate, measurable layer of how the brain and mind distribute information. a biological reflection of the same complementarity that physics has already found in the fabric of matter. For decades, we have been conditioned to separate the inner from the outer, the observer from the observed. Yet when you examine both closely enough, the separation collapses. The patterns of supersymmetry and physics, pairs of particles, one visible and one hidden, echo perfectly the structure of human cognition. Rational thought and intuitive insight are not competing forces, but interdependent states that stabilize each other. Like quantum pairs maintaining balance across dimensions, the other side isn't a ghostly presence or higher self. It's the parallel mode of perception that keeps the system of consciousness coherent. Neuroscience has begun to glimpse this architecture. Imaging studies show that during moments of deep insight or aha recognition, the brain doesn't light up in one region, but across distant networks simultaneously. Logical processing in the prefrontal cortex synchronizes with emotional and sensory regions in the limbic system and midbrain. The timing is so precise that it mirrors quantum coherence, a temporary alignment of separate elements behaving as a single organism. In those milliseconds, the boundary between cognition and perception fades. Awareness becomes a unified field of activity, the biological signature of complementarity in action. This realization reframes the nature of thought itself. We tend to imagine thinking as a linear process, as if ideas were manufactured step by step. But the brain operates more like a quantum system, oscillating between potentials until one pattern stabilizes as awareness. Your conscious mind experiences that stabilization as a decision or a realization, yet beneath it lies a dynamic field of probabilities constantly interacting. What you call intuition, imagination, or inspiration are simply the ways your mind accesses information before it crystallizes into verbal form. The other side is not mystical intuition, it's pre-verbal computation, faster, non-linear, multidimensional. When you recognize this, self-awareness takes on new precision. You no longer see your rational and intuitive impulses as opposites, but as phases of the same process. The rational mind observes and articulates, the intuitive mind anticipates and assembles. Each completes what the other cannot finish alone. The real transformation is understanding that consciousness doesn't live in a hierarchy. It lives in symmetry. And the degree to which those layers communicate determines the clarity of perception, the coherence of emotion, and even the quality of physical energy that flows through you. The implications ripple outward. What psychology calls balance, what philosophy calls wisdom, what spirituality calls awakening, all may describe the same biological phenomenon: synchronized symmetry across cognitive and perceptual layers. When the system loses that symmetry, we experience confusion, anxiety, or fragmentation. When it regains it, we experience peace, insight, and vitality. Nothing mystical has occurred. It's the physics of consciousness, restoring its internal coherence. This understanding also explains why presence, simple awareness of the now, feels so restorative. When attention stops jumping between past and future, the two modes of perception finally overlap in real time. Rational awareness ceases chasing what's next, and intuitive awareness stops projecting what might be. The moment expands because both hemispheres of consciousness are active simultaneously, creating a single, resonant perception of existence. It is not transcendence, it is synchronization. The same principle extends beyond the individual. The collective mind, societies, cultures, even scientific paradigms often function in a symmetry. One half dominates: logic without empathy, technology without reflection, progress without coherence. The transformation that begins within a single consciousness inevitably challenges the systems built on division. To restore symmetry personally is to begin restoring it collectively, because awareness is contagious in the same way resonance is. When one instrument finds tune, it invites others to adjust. And this, finally, is the point that transforms everything. The understanding that consciousness isn't a static entity, but a symmetrical process, measurable, testable, and profoundly human. The other side isn't mystical, it's mechanical in the deepest, most elegant sense. Just as nature pairs forces to maintain equilibrium, the mind pairs perspectives to maintain awareness. Once that becomes clear, the frontier of inquiry shifts entirely. The question is no longer whether consciousness is connected to reality, but how deeply that connection extends, and what new forms of intelligence emerge when the full symmetry of mind is allowed to express itself through everyday life. When you finally see consciousness as a symmetrical field, not a single voice but a dual current flowing in balance, everything aligns. Science and experience stop contradicting each other. They begin to describe the same law from opposite sides. Supersymmetry was never just about particles. It was a map pointing back to you. Every intuition, every moment of clarity, every surge of presence is proof that your mind and matter are reflections of one unified system learning to know itself. The more you live from that wholeness, the more reality responds in kind, not through miracles, but through coherence. If you reach this point, write "I'm in symmetry" in the comments so I know you made it to the end. And if this exploration spoke to you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen right now. They'll take you even deeper into how consciousness and reality mirror each other,